Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you are. A very warm welcome for joining us in another session of the ACMtalks series supported by Chris Foundation. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our speaker for tonight, Anissa Rahadiningtyas, because this is the kind of forum or platform where, we don't have it often enough in terms of discussion between traditional forms of Islamic art and what might constitute as modern or contemporary Islamic art. So I'm really looking forward to a presentation tonight on Tulisan Jawi, Decolonizing the Modern and the Islamic in Indonesian Art. So Anissa is an art historian who earned her PhD in art history from Cornell University, and she's currently an assistant curator of Islamic aesthetics in modern and contemporary Southeast Asia at the National Gallery of Singapore. Her research interests include Indian Ocean studies, post-colonial and decolonial theories, comparative modernisms, gender and feminism, and Islamic studies. And without further ado, let's hand over the time to Anissa. Anissa, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nora, for the kind introduction. And thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this awesome series of talk. And thank you, Junel from Purple Forest to, make this process as smooth as possible. All right, so I'm gonna start sharing my screen in the presentation. Okay, so as Nora mentioned, the title of this talk is Tulisan Jawi, Decolonizing the Modern, quote-unquote, and the Islamic, quote-unquote, in Indonesian art. In this talk, I will discuss Indonesian artists' strategy in exploring the textual and artistic capacity of Jawi in their modern and contemporary artistic practices since the 1970s onwards. I will focus on the works of A.D. Pirus and Rahmayani, two artists that I have worked with extensively since I started my research in 2017. I will also introduce Ahmad Sadali, another prominent artist in Indonesia, and his idea on the use of Jawi as a prelude to my discussion on Pirus and Rahmayani. Sadali's engagement with Jawi emerged out of his anti-colonial position and the nationalist search for identity during the New Order period in Indonesia with Islam at its root. While Sadali's conviction of the importance of Jawi never manifested on his canvas, as far as I know, Pirus brought Jawi to contemporary audiences as a way to approach Quranic texts that are mediated by Achinese and Malay literary traditions. Rahmayani's installations and performances, on the other hand, pushed the use of Jawi outside the realm of religious expression of normative piety and opened the potential of Jawi as a site and a tool to challenge and complicate the narrative of global Islam and the notion of quote-unquote Islamic art as singular and homogeneous. I argue, therefore, that these engagements with Jawi bring to the fore distinct memories, experiences, and strategies towards becoming modern and quote-unquote Islamic. So known also as Arab Pagong in Java, although there are some letters that has a slight difference. Jawi is a localized writing system derived from Arabic that circulated in many parts of the Indo-Malay archipelago. As a writing system in Indonesia, Jawi was largely forgotten, marginalized, and replaced when Roman script or Romawi was introduced through the Dutch colonial education system in the 19th and 20th centuries. While schools in British Malaya still taught Jawi to students in the 1950s, albeit limited to certain subjects, it was largely out of use in newly independent Indonesia. Jawi was pushed to the margins of modernity of the new republic as it existed mainly as a language in Muslim religious learning. Only those who studied in Pesantren or the Quranic school or madrasah or the Islamic school in rural Java and other parts of the archipelago, or those whose families prescribed extended study of Islamic ethics and jurisprudence after finishing the Quran would learn Jawi using Kitab Kuning, or the Yellow Book. Kitab Kuning is a term used to identify religious books and manuscripts that are written in Arabic script, irrespective of the language. Even though Kitab Kuning also circulated in modern Islamic schools, the use of Jawi was still limited to religious context, inevitably reinforcing the majority of Indonesians' uneasy relationship with Arabic as a script. So A.D. Peirus and Rahmayani represent two different generations of artistic training in Bandung, which is a city in West Java, Indonesia. So formerly a colonial institution established by the Dutch in 1947 during the period of the Indonesian Revolution, the Universitair Leergang voor de Opleiding van Tekenleraar gradually morphed into a state art school known as the Faculty of Art and Design Institut Teknologi Bandung, or FSRD ITB. These generational difference prompts Peirus and Rahmayani to respond to different transnational and global discourses relating to art, modernity, and Islam that engender constant disruptions, revisions, and contradictions. Peirus experienced a more direct conversation with Euro-American model of modernism, introduced by the Dutch teachers through the formalist language of abstraction. Peirus began to incorporate Quranic calligraphy in the early 1970s, and his pioneering effort and explorations of the form and materiality of Arabic script accorded him an authoritative position in the history of modern art and modern Islamic art in Indonesia. Rahmayani, on the other hand, represents a younger generation's restless and political mindedness that challenged the largely masculine modernist aesthetics and its pretext of neutrality and disinterestedness in social and political issues. Using performance and installation as strategies of representation that foreground the agency of the body, especially the female body, Rahmayani strived to inspire social and political changes during the authoritarian New Order regime. Rahmayani's works from the 90s and early 2000s attend to the issue of misogyny and violence against women and minority groups during the authoritarian period. Her subsequent works, which I will sort of talk about today, show a shift in focus as she seeks to present experiences and realities of Muslims and women that actively contribute to shaping the image of global Islam. Performance and installation became Rahmayani's method of political and environmental activism, where she gradually articulates the importance of collaboration as a strategy of reparation. I read reparation as a framework in post-colonial and feminist studies that is extended from Eve Sedgwick's approach of quote-unquote reparative reading that I will elaborate further in this talk. So in this paper, I engage with the notion of decoloniality developed from the decolonial school of thought initiated by Aníbal Quijano in the 90s. Drawing from Walter Minolo and Catherine Walsh, I understand decolonizing as an active process of delinking and detaching from the structure of knowledge that shaped and are shaped by modernity and therefore coloniality. This delinking allows one to engage in what Minolo terms as quote-unquote epistemic reconstitution. According to Minolo, an epistemic reconstitution is achieved by reconstituting, quote, ways of thinking, languages, ways of life and being in the world that the rhetoric of modernity disavow and the logic of coloniality implement, unquote. Peirus and Rahmayani's engagement with Jawi can be understood as one method for attending to the aforementioned tall order of decolonial objectives, as they reconstitute the script, its history and memories, and its role in the transmission of knowledge that was destituted and marginalized by the colonial system of power and institutions. Each artist engages and reworks Jawi in various levels in order to decolonize the established aesthetics of modern and modern Islamic art, as well as the dominant discourses of Islam and of being Islamic. So losing Jawi and the absence of Islam. So on the scattered typed up notes that Sadali seemed to have prepared for an article or a talk, he expressed his observation of the absence of Islam in the history of modern art in Indonesia. Sadali detailed several reasons. 1, colonial policy against Islam in the colony. 2, post-colonial trauma and inferiority complexes that result in the reverence of anything Western, including art. And 3, the continuation of the colonial education system in Indonesia that gradually replaced Arabic script with Romawi as the writing system in schools. This process resulted in removing Islam even further from the consciousness and daily practices of the people, intellectuals, and artists in Indonesia. In this draft pages filled with handwritten notes, Sadali argued that these are the reasons why artists had neglected Islam as the guiding principle in life, and thus had neglected to produce art inspired by Islam. Sadali further noted that these are the conditions that inflicted the development of Islam and Islamic art in Indonesia. This note critically pinpoints the social and political processes that led to the diminishing role of Jawi in public practical matters. Colonial policies against Islam in Java became increasingly systematized after the occurrence of the Java War from 1825 to 1830. To prevent future uprisings like that of the Java War, which was a rebellion that united peasants and aristocracy under the banner of Islam, the colonial government was determined to sever affiliations between the royal courts and pesantren or the Quranic schools. Javanese royals were discouraged from forming any connections with the Kiais or Hajis, or religious teachers and leaders, who mostly built their authority in pesantrens in rural areas. As noted by Peter Carey, this approach also increased the gap between the aristocracy and the Kiais, or the religious leaders, exacerbated by the institutionalization of kulturstelsel, or the forced cultivation system in 1830. This gap turned into a class struggle, as the Kiais were seen as the representation of the lower class, and pesantrens as sites of struggles against the ruling elites in the latter half of the 19th century. The Dutch continued to undermine the role and position of Islam in Java's social and cultural identity. One of the strategies used to further widen the socio-cultural gap was to construct a distinction between court art and folk art, and to develop a colonial canon of local cultures. Laurie Sears has discussed how 19th and 20th century Dutch colonial discourses minimized the importance of religious role of Islam. Looking closely at the stories and performances of wayang, or Javanese shadow theater, Sears notes that the colonial suppression of the outward expression of Islam by Javanese regents, or officials, colonial officials, and the Dutch scholarly preference for quote-unquote Hindu Javanese rather than Islamic knowledge were cultural strategies to impose the view that Islam in Java was merely superficial. The contact between some Javanese Muslims with the Arabian Wahhabi movement also exacerbated this erasure of Islam from Javanese cultural traditions. After the Dutch changed the status of the Netherlands Indies from a commercial venture to a colony, the Dutch colonial government instituted a more expansive establishment of the education system that further marginalized pesantren education. Along with the instatement of the ethisch politiek, or the ethical policy in 1901, the colonial government built more schools as a way to uplift the people through education and cultural associations with the Netherlands. The Dutch established a 3-year volksschool, or village school, where the Western type elementary education system was first introduced to the masses. Many Javanese, especially those with royal ties, preferred to enter the Dutch schools as it guaranteed them future placements as colonial government officials. In the schools, training in Roman script and command of Dutch and other European languages naturally became more necessary than Arabic or Jawi. As noted by Sadali, disuse and spread of the Roman script by the Dutch violently replaced Jawi as a script that could and should have been part of the modern Indonesian language system. Sadali's note evokes the discourse of loss of Islamic identity and belonging due to colonial violence that resulted in the stunted development of calligraphy as a form of modern artistic expression. Thus, for Sadali to decolonize the modern artistic practice in Indonesia, one must acknowledge this colonial erasure and to work to emphasize the importance of Islam and its textual and material manifestations. A.D. Pira's exploration of Arabic scripts started with rendering Quranic verses into his calligraphic painting, a practice of incorporating Quranic calligraphy into his modernist abstract paintings that he pioneered with Ahmad Sadali in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Different from calligraphy murni, or pure calligraphy that refers to quote-unquote traditional calligraphy, calligraphic painting is defined in the context of Indonesian modern Islamic art as, quote, painting that adopts the forms and characters of calligraphy and transforms it into a new and complete form, unquote. In the 1980s and 1990s, Lukisan calligraphy or calligraphic painting developed into the canonical representation of modern Islamic art as it was perceived as a proper expression of Islamic piety. So Eddie Piros's 1985 painting that we see here perhaps marks his early use of Jawi that was meant to show great emphasis on legibility and meaning. This emphasis on producing proper writings that engender immutable meaning is highlighted by the juxtaposition of the Quranic text with its translation in Malay, written in Jawi, composed in the style of a page from an Islamic manuscript rendered in off-white and light ochre. The texts are housed in a chamber divided by a thick golden line made by pasting gold leaves, referencing the long tradition of illuminating manuscripts with gold in parts of Islamic Southeast Asia. The importance of legibility is further demonstrated in the long title of the painting, which also summarizes the meaning of the verse 27 from Surah Luqman. Sehutan kalam selawatan mangsi, tiadalah asma Allah tertuliskan. A forest of pens, a sea of ink, the beautiful names of Allah never ceased being written. In this painting, the Quranic verse of Surah Luqman is positioned on the left side, with its translation in Malay on the right. Piros orients the viewer to read the Quranic verse first before the translation, as both Arabic and Jawi reads from left to right. The Malay translation is written in Jawi. This is the Quranic verse, and the Malay translation is written in Jawi on the right. It says, sekiranya segala pohon yang di bumi merupakan kalam, dan samudera merupakan mangsi, ditambah lagi 7 lautan sesudah itu. Tiadalah kata Allah bisa dituliskan. Sungguh Allah Maha Perkasa, Maha Bijaksana. Kenneth George argues that the use of Jawi in this painting displays Piros's effort to localize universal Islam to its specific development and translation in the Malay world. I will add that through this work, Piros also reintroduced the importance of Jawi as a cultural and literary product of the propagation of Islam in the archipelago. Jawi is the evidence of the adaptability of Islam and the transmutability of the Arabic script. Using Jawi for Piros is a way to reclaim the script's profound importance in the transmission of knowledge and circulation of Islam in the archipelago since the 15th century, at least. This painting brought Jawi to a contemporary audience whose relationship with Jawi and Arabic remain only as memories of a distant past and religious texts. In the context of this painting, however, juxtaposing Jawi with the calligraphic condition of a Quranic verse reiterates the relationship of Jawi only to its religious function. So expanding Jawi. In 2009, Aramayani staged an installation titled I Love You, social sculpture after Joseph Beuys in Esplanade, Singapore, accompanied by her participatory performance of Proyek Bendera or Flag Project, where she invited participants to write words that manifest critical terms and hopes for a better present and future. Aramayani installed a soft hanging sculpture made up of a colorful rendition of Jawi script that reads, I love you in English. Aramayani's adaptation of Jawi in her installations and performances serves to carry out a reparative project for the image of global Islam. In several of Aramayani's collaborative and performance projects, such as I Love You, using Jawi is one strategy among many to show possibilities to view differently the relationship between Islam and the global world that is marked by violence and distrust. So in this footage that opens with a distant shot of the esplanade, the camera moves swiftly into the interior of the open space where I Love You hangs on the ceiling. It then moves to the crowd of participants of Aramayani's flag project. Let me get to that. Oh, there you go. Holding multicolored banners with different scripts and writing on them. After recording Aramayani giving instructions to her collaborators, the footage jumps to an activity outside where everyone moves and waves their banners. Aramayani is then seen running across the visual field with a yellow banner that reads, I love you, written in red. In addition to this phrase, collaborators also wave flags bearing words such as justice, mabuhay, and several others in Mandarin and other languages. In my writing on Aramayani, I contextualize her practice within the framework of reparation and reparative feminism. Scholars have extended the notion of reparation in post-colonial and feminist studies beyond the concern of racial slavery in the European and US context. Eve Sedgwick proposes the use of reparative reading as an intervention against paranoid approaches as the dominant forms of cultural critique, including in Marxism, feminism, post-colonial, and queer theory. Drawing from Sedgwick, Joshua Chambers-Letson further situates reparative reading within feminist and post-colonial projects, and notes that various feminist, queer, and post-colonial projects have always been inherently reparative. Chambers-Letson defines reparation as a way to address historical injury and violence while acknowledging the guilt that comes with this process. By coming to terms with the past, quote, as a means of putting oneself together, at least enough to be able to move into the future and possibility of love, unquote. Seeking the possibility of love in relation to the injuries of our past and present affected by colonialism and political decolonization seems to be Rahmayani's underlying determination that guides her works. The hanging installation of the soft sculpture has a precedent in Rahmayani's collaborative work titled Stitching the Wound, with a silk weaving Muslim community in Bangkok, Thailand, that occurred in 2006. At the core of these works is Rahmayani's commitment and feeling of responsibility as a Muslim in extending transcultural dialogues that can generate reparative readings of Islam and Muslims in the global contemporary world. In light of the inherent violence in the act of decolonization and reparation, Rahmayani's works might serve as a means of negotiating such violence through community-based collaborative practice that encompass ritual and play. Performed and exhibited at Jim Thompson House in Bangkok, Stitching the Wound emerged from a year-long community-based project that involved collaborators from the Bangkok silk weaving community in Bangkok. Stitching the Wound offers several layers of engagement with ritual and play with the community as well as with the public. Before the public opening in 23rd June 2006 at Jim Thompson House, Rahmayani engaged in months-long workshop with the local Muslim communities. She aimed to highlight the involvement of the young girls who made their colorful silk dresses for their dance performance on the opening night. Rahmayani explains her decision to work with young girls from the community as an approach to generate an exchange replete with surprises. In addition to these collaborative performances, Rahmayani also created an installation with a soft sculpture titled Thread 2006, made of silk and synthetic fiber that is partly hung and partly placed on the ground in the main gallery space. As you can see, this is the photo. This colorful and light rendition of Jawi letters is accompanied by another hanging textilic installation titled Needle that was produced in a sewing workshop Rahmayani organized with women of the community. Rahmayani asserts that she transforms the form of a prayer robe worn by Muslim women into a tent-like colorful installation made of silk. As with Thread, Needle serves to contrast the quote-unquote heaviness of the representations of Islam pictured in Western media since Iran's Islamic Revolution in 1979. Both sculptural forms serve as a stage within the gallery where meaningful exchanges between the collaborators and audience transpire by way of dance performances and the circulation of specially designed cookies, also in the shape of Jawi letters. The performance of Proyek Bendera, or the flag project that accompanied the I Love You installation, is also a part of a nomadic community-based project that shows how Rahmayani's approach to addressing the marginalization of women also extends to other minoritized and socioeconomic, politically repressed groups. The project seeks to emphasize the value of pluralism and religious diversity, as well as a concern for environmental issues, a logical extension from Rahmayani's long-standing critiques against capitalism. As with Stitching the Wound, this project began to develop in 2006 from a collaboration with the community at one of the oldest Quranic school or pesantren in Yogyakarta, named Pesantren Amu Marta, after an earthquake devastated the area. The collaboration is a material manifestation of the concerns, thoughts, and hopes that emerged out of prolonged discussion and engagement between Rahmayani and the community by stitching words written in various scripts and languages onto the flags. The collaboration is not limited to the collaborative performance, as Rahmayani also worked long-term together with the pesantren to spread awareness about environmental issues to the students. and also to work on different environmental projects as well. Since then, the flag project has gone through several reenactments and recontextualization, as she has worked with various communities in Indonesia, in Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and most recently in Tibet with the monks in one of the monasteries there. Drawing from the purpose of and material elements in Stitching the Wound and Proyek Bendera, or the flag project, I Love You was specifically developed to respond to the context of Singapore, where the performance took place. In this work, Rahmayani and the group that she worked with aimed to address the multiracial and multi-ethnic social and political reality in Singapore, as well as to show vernacular Islam through Jawi script that carries an active expression of love. And in response to Iola Lenzi about this work in 2009, she was a curator who also organized the Stitching the Wound exhibition with Rahmayani. Rahmayani describes how the performance is significant in the context of Singapore, with its history of racial tension and where Islam is a minoritized religion. She states, "The Islamic teaching I have had from my parents and ancestors puts a great deal of emphasis on love. It is an important principle, and loving one's neighbors as well as one's family is considered obligatory. I know that the Muslims in Singapore are in the minority, and mostly Malay. I think the proactive legislation protecting the rights of minorities is what everybody needs. In this globalized world, people are migrating from one place to another willingly or due to economic forces, so there are minorities everywhere, and they have to be protected. I hope this piece of work will say something to Muslims and Singaporeans in general, something about equality, about kindness, compassion, and respect and solidarity for the others, especially the minority." So to conclude, Rahmayani's exploration and manipulation of Jawi certainly brings the script out of its previously narrow religious use and into the purview of her global audience and collaborators. Her use of Jawi builds on the efforts and awareness to restitute a writing system that was marginalized by the colonial matrix of power. Ahmad Sadali's note on the loss of Jawi as one of the causes of the impeded development of Islamic art in Indonesia is the first step to thinking about and understanding the impact of coloniality. A.D. Pirus's modernist painting subsequently recovered Jawi as a Malay textual tradition and a key element in the transmission of knowledge regarding Islam in the Indo-Malay archipelago. His decision to put the Malay translation of a Quranic verse in Jawi serves to emphasize the importance of legibility, as it ties to Pirus's ethical responsibility and notion of being a good Muslim. At the same time, the presence of Jawi next to the Quranic verse in Arabic and Pirus's calligraphic painting also shows the degree of indigenization of Islam in the archipelago that is beyond superficial, as it was observed and noted by the Dutch colonial scholars and administrators. Pirus and Rahmayani's adaptation of Jawi and experimentation with calligraphy, therefore, speaks to the persistence of the textual past that is open to dialogue not only with Euro-American model of modernism, but also with discourses of global contemporary art, nomadic activism, and global Islam. Thank you.
Thank you, Anissa, for that really rich look at mainly two Indonesian artists' work. Their responses in terms of utilizing Jawi script for what it can signify about their cultural and religious heritage. What I want to kind of just do here is to highlight some more traditional forms of Islamic art that we have in the ACM collection. And just to set a little bit of context, within sort of the general frame of Islamic art, calligraphy comes up over and over again as really the highest form of artistic expression across the Islamic world. So this has been something that is well regarded since Islam emerged, and is really tied back to the status of the Quran as the word of God and the need to produce copies. So alongside with that, there's really the development of various arts associated with the book. And calligraphy is one aspect, and you have illumination as well as book binding. Just give me a second. I'm struck actually by how Piers was referring to manuscript traditions in Southeast Asia and also the Islamic tradition. And this is really the strength of the ACM collection, which would be the Islamic Southeast Asia. And what I'm highlighting here are pages from 3 regional styles that are well regarded, that emanate from this region and have their own distinctive characteristics. I think broadly, if you see across the 3 pages, from left to right, you have the Terengganu or East Coast Malay style. And so this would be a style that is perhaps shared from Terengganu all the way to Patani in today's southern Thailand. And then in the middle is a page from an Achinese Quran. And then on the right is a page from a Quran that was found in South Sumatra, but in terms of its stylistic features, it's generally identified as Javanese. So that also highlights another point about how Quranic manuscripts, and in fact other types of illuminated manuscripts, if they're produced in a certain locale, they don't necessarily stay within that locale and are sometimes circulated or commissioned by patrons from other parts of the region. And so, you know, there is definitely opportunity for cross-pollination in terms of the illumination style. And I really kind of, you know, my question to Anissa at this point is, you know, whether Piers was actually referring to a specific manuscript tradition. It's interesting that he's looking at reproducing the Quranic verses faithfully. I mean, that is generally compulsory or mandatory in producing Quranic verses. And then by the side of it, you have the Malay translation. And then in terms of the frame itself, actually from that particular work, it's actually a little difficult to work out where he might be referring to. It really is, you know, seems to take on sort of a more abstract form. And as you can see on these examples here, the Terengganu style favors a more undulating frames. It's dense and incredibly ornate. The Achinese style, you know, pretty much it's centered on this rectangular frame. The gold is definitely apparent then. This ties back also to the notion, I mean, yellow or gold is associated with royalty and nobility in this region. And so that, you know, is extended to the Quran as well, which is, you know, regarded as a sacred text and therefore worthy or deserving of bearing gold as illumination. In fact, I think to some degree, what Piers actually kind of used is perhaps referencing other kinds of manuscript traditions outside of the Islamic Southeast Asia. So it's just an interesting choice that he made. If you look at these examples here, just to kind of highlight sort of the extensive double spread illumination that you would encounter in the Southeast Asian Quran. And this is an example of how the Terengganu style, for example, is really held up as one of the finest illumination styles in this region traditionally. And this is a Quran from West Sulawesi, so that's on the other end of the Indo-Malay archipelago. And you can see that it also bears some similarities to the Terengganu style, and it seems to suggest that, you know, the influence and the reach of Terengganu manuscript illumination. Here's an example of where Jawi is actually used. So in the previous examples, it is Quranic manuscript in Arabic, but in this case, this is fully Jawi. And interestingly and unusually, it is actually a birth announcement, and it's from Lingga, and it's announcing the birth of a daughter. And in terms of the regard that's given to this news, you can see it being expressed through the decorative frames that surround the simple announcement that ends with a prayer and supplication. And this style, again, seems to reference very strongly the Terengganu style. So that seems to be sort of the prevalent visual vocabulary and language for the region, at least up to the 19th and early 20th century. The other aspect of Piers's work about integrating the Malay translation as part of the core text, actually there are earlier references of how to kind of put in 2 different languages the Arabic text, as well as the indigenous language that's written in Arabic script. In this case, this is a collection of hadith produced in Java. So the text that you see in the main body in black and in red, this would be in Arabic. And then there are notes that are interlinear as well as surrounding the page. And this arrangement in sort of a pinwheel form is actually sort of derivative of the swastika form as well. And so there are actually, there's actually in a way sort of a standard or a tradition of how to kind of insert a different language into the same page, even though they are utilizing Arabic, they're both utilizing Arabic script. Another way to kind of really denote the difference is actually to take a look at the diacritic marks. And these are glyphs that, as shown here on the page, they occur either above or below the main Arabic letters. And that's to guide non-native Arabic speakers in terms of how to use the vowel sounds in reading the Arabic language. And then if you look along the sides where presumably this would be Javanese in Arabic script, there are no diacritic marks because the assumption here is that the reader is conversant enough in the vernacular language to be able to read this and understand where to place the vowel sounds. And then I want to kind of address a last type of manuscript that we have in our collection. And here, although the writing is in Jawi, what is actually more curious is the form of the manuscript in itself, which is a folding book format. And this is not a format that is conventionally associated with the Islamic world. Traditionally, you know, in terms of manuscript, it's always produced as a bound codex form or a bound book. And this manuscript in itself, this particular accordion folding book format is actually a format that's associated with mainland Southeast Asia, specifically in Myanmar, and it's known as a Burmese parabaik. So the pages are blackened here, and it's actually a sort of recyclable manuscript because it's been blackened with charcoal, and you could actually rub off the surface, re-blacken, and write new text on it. So this is how this particular manuscript format works. And what I've actually displayed this earlier in another situation outside of the ACM, and this was actually in the Budidaya exhibition that took place around 2014 to 2015 at the Malay Heritage Center. And the idea of this exhibition is to look at the concept of Budi as a basis. Budi is basically wisdom or intellect, and it's about how you enact Budi in action and practice. And it actually is sort of the root of the word budaya, which is culture in Malay. And for this particular instance, it was a conscious and deliberate decision to juxtapose the Patani manuscript next to this contemporary work by a Malaysian artist, Shahrul Jamili Misgon. And this work, if you look at it closely, it's sculptural, it's made out of etched aluminum. And quoting Malaysian thinker and philosopher Syed Muhammad Natib Alatas, Shahrul Jamili reintroduces what has now become an age-old Malay adage, meletakkan sesuatu pada tempatnya, which means putting something in its rightful place. So that's the Jawi inscription that you see engraved or etched on the aluminum. And it's a, you know, he's put it in a form that is sculptural, that is origami. And now looking back at the installation in itself, beside the manuscript, you know, this particular Patani manuscript also seems to have similar sort of origami forms. And here it just seems the writing is secondary. And, you know, we're highlighting the fact that it is also kind of lost to audiences, whether it is a traditional or historical manuscript or contemporary work. And this is, you know, a theme that I feel happens over and over again with regards to how Jawi script has been relegated and narrowed to the sphere of just religious text, whereas before it was really the main writing system across all of Islamic Southeast Asia, and it's used to write not just Malay but all the different languages, vernacular languages in this region. So it really actually works almost like the Romanized alphabet that we use today to write many different languages as well. So I kind of think about how, Anissa, you talked about these artists reclaiming Jawi script as a decolonizing strategy. And I wonder about Jawi, how Jawi came about in this region. I mean, the earliest that we usually date it to is the Batu Bersurat Terengganu, which is dated to 1303 AD. So at least by then, the 14th century, we can be assured that, you know, Jawi script is actually in use, because the stone, the Terengganu stone inscription in itself, basically is a kind of royal edict of the local ruler. So it already kind of shows that Islam is a state religion of sort, and therefore the adoption of the Jawi script. Unfortunately, it's not, you know, very clear how exactly Jawi came about, other than, you know, through conversion to the religion and this perhaps impulse or motivation to relate to the larger Islamic world, which a lot of the communities here were definitely in contact with and trading as well. So I wonder if at a certain point in time, you know, whether we can think of Jawi or even Islam as a kind of modernizing force as well, because this would be a system that replaced earlier systems of writing as well. And I mean, today it's become so synonymous and identical with, you know, not just Malay heritage, but also other cultural heritage of this region, that it actually is less religious and more of a cultural past. So, you know, this is something that I would like to hear more from Anissa about. Also, the other interesting point for me is how Aramayani used English in Jawi as a way to kind of, you know, highlight the concept of love. I mean, and that would only be something that a Jawi speaker, I mean, a Jawi reader would be able to interpret from the letters. And I think from what's always struck me when reading English that's been transliterated into Jawi is that unlike the earlier example where in order to indicate different languages, you actually introduce diacritic marks to highlight what is local, modern vernacular versus perhaps a non-native language. This doesn't actually happen very often with English in Jawi. And, you know, most times that I've come across these situations, it's often, you know, words that spell or start to sound really strange if you think about them as being Malay words. And then finally, you know, you have that aha moment that it's actually English. So it's interesting how English within Jawi is not demarcated the same way as you would kind of highlight between Arabic and, you know, non-Arabic script. So I think we'll let Anissa sort of respond to this while we also take questions. Please type your questions in the Q&A box.
Yeah, thank you, Nora, for all the questions. I mean, all are difficult questions, which I don't know if I can answer fully or like answer satisfactorily to all of these questions. And thank you as well for showing us all of these like wonderful manuscripts in ACM collection. It's really interesting to see, you know, the difference in style there. I mean, I've seen several manuscripts in Southeast Asian manuscripts, but not really in person. And it would be great to have that, like to have that sort of comparative, you know, it's like several manuscripts sort of just like put side by side, and then we can sort of like just discuss about it. But so for your first question about what might, like which manuscripts tradition that Pirus might be looking at, that's a really good question. I think at first probably Pirus probably looked at the Achenese manuscript tradition. So he's sort of, there's this turning point in his artistic career where, you know, when he went to the US, like to continue his study, like he went to the Metropolitan Art Museum, And then he saw the Islamic art gallery at the time. Like that was like very recently, not open, but like very recently revamped or something like that. Like in the, or maybe it was before the revamp. It's like in the 1960, sorry, end of 1969, 1971, where he was when he was in New York. So when he went to the Met and he saw all of these like manuscripts like being displayed in like the Metropolitan Art Museum and being considered as art, right? So that time he was like, oh, turns out that these objects that I used to see, that he used to see when he was growing up in Aceh, it was part of it, like it could be considered as art. So that was like his moment of like reckoning, I think. And then, so when he went back to Indonesia, he did a lot of research into Acehese visual and material traditions. So not only looking at manuscripts, I think, but also looking at textiles, looking at Aceh, Batu Aceh, or the Acehese like tombstones, right? That was pretty. That is a pretty important archaeological materials for scholars to sort of like argue when did Islam come to the archipelago, basically. And so he did research on all of these materials. So I think probably this is just my presumption, and just based on his stories, he probably looked at Acehese manuscript first. But also, although I don't know precisely which manuscript that he actually saw, hopefully I can go back to Bandung very soon, and then I can have a chat with Piers, and then we can have this, I can ask all of these questions. But then towards the 90s, I think his research sort of developed and sort of manifest in his paintings, like this one. And I think if you see this painting, the painting that I showed you as well, there is this very minimal sort of decorations, which, like, looking at the manuscripts that you showed me, it's sort of like it's sort of maybe closer to the Acehese manuscript, because it's the box, or what did you the term that you used before, like the box where the calligraphies are, they are this just little box like within a page, right? And that's the painting by Piros sort of like more similar to that, but then a more sort of more like ornamented ones that you showed from Terengganu and other places. Yeah, and I mean, he did a lot of research for the exhibitions, festivals in 1991 and 1995, because there was this huge festival of Islamic arts and culture that he organized, Piros organized in Jakarta, where he actually displayed a lot of manuscripts from a lot of different places, and in Java, in Sumatra, and also maybe from the neighboring regions, like from Kelantan and so forth. In this particular festival, is still like the biggest festival of Islamic arts and culture in the region, I think. It will be great to talk about this, or like to show you the archives that I have for these. And then about your second question about how Jawi came about in the region, that's also yeah, I don't know the answer to that as well. But I think you made a good point about Jawi as a modernizing force, that it replaced another sort of writing systems, right? And there's a shift in civilization as well, like from Hindu Buddhist to Islamic in the region, and with that, like a shift in the way knowledge is transmitted. So yeah, I'm not sure how to sort of properly answer that one. And for the last,
if I could just jump in here, I think it's also thinking about how the development of Jawi is actually a modified Arabic script. because in order to kind of capture the different sounds of the local languages, there are certain sounds that are not available in the original Arabic letters. So, for example, ng and nya and ch and ga, these are sounds that we use a lot in Malay and also associated or related languages. But then that kind of necessitated modifications in the Arabic script. So how that happens is that there's actually additional letters that are created. But interestingly, in other instances where Arabic script has been adopted as a vernacular, to write vernacular languages of the region, for example, Farsi in Iran and then Urdu in northern India and Pakistan, the choices that they make in terms of which letters to modify and then adapt and add to the language is actually would actually be different to the choices that we make here in terms of which letters to modify and add to the alphabet. And so, even within the actual writing of the script itself, at least in terms of how it reflects regionalities, we can actually spot that through a close reading of the script. So, this is something that, I wonder, whether for modern contemporary artists, because what I also tend to notice in terms of trying to address the question of Islamic art in modern contemporary sense is that, we can't really seem to run away from calligraphy and from Arabic script in a sense, and that this is often being used as a marker of either identity or to maybe address something, but it's still, a medium that is not very well understood by a general audience. So it's still, to me, as enigmatic and mysterious unless you really kind of read in Jawi or the script itself. Yeah. So I just wanted to kind of raise this point as well.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, I agree with you on all of those points. Yeah, and then your questions about like the English, like how sort of Rahmayani uses English in this work and I Love You. I think one of the things that she does is to use Jawi to strike up, or to use basically forms that are, like Jawi, like to strike up conversation and dialogues, and to sort of show. I think specifically using Jawi is to show there is not a different kind of Islam, but there is sort of like a localized Islam, although Islam is localized everywhere, right? But I mean, by using Jawi, it sort of like locates the understanding of Islam, or like people's imagination of Islam, or like to detach people's imaginations of Islam from like this very idea that are sort of shaped by Western media of how Islam is of how Islam is supposed to be, what, like a full of terror, all of these like ideas that are, especially after 9/11, like being sort of propaganda, like being propagated like again and again. And to the point, I think that people in Indonesia also, like we have a certain kind of like sort of association of the kind of Islam that's sort of like, oh, you're like this group is more of a sort of like a radical conservative kind of Islam. And then there's this effort to sort of detach like the kind of Islam that let's say someone like Rahmayani believes and experiences, with with the kind of Islam being depicted in Western media. And I think using English, especially in the context of Singapore and in the context of like other places where English is commonly used, is a way to also show that, or is a way to sort of, bridge this dialogue, this transcultural dialogue, basically. I think that's her main focus of using English. But like you said about the use of English and like I was reading this. I have this like Jawi reading group where we read this Malay magazines from like the 1950s, and we encountered all of these like English words, and we were like, what is this? This is not supposed to be that hard. But projector is written like very differently, and sometimes it's easy to catch. I learned Arabic before, and we learned about this like English, like how to write English name in Arabic. So I kind of have that sort of like training in my head, so it's much easier to sort of identify that. But I think for someone who's not used to that, it can be so like, well, it's just so weird.
Actually, that leads really nicely to a question from the audience, from JL, who's asking what is the general attitude towards Jawi being used for English words. And I think, it's, in a way, it's a necessity, especially in terms of spelling names. I mean, that's one of the first instances where English is actually used in Jawi. I'm actually interested, Anissa, you said that you had training in terms of how to kind of spot or at least be able to distinguish when it's, English being written in Jawi. And, could you maybe elaborate on what sort of things to look out for? Because what I was mentioning earlier was that, you don't have the diacritic marks to kind of at least signal that this is a different language from the main language that it's being written in.
Yeah. So in terms of, I think the way I do it is to sort of identify like an unusual sequence of like letters. Right? Because if we read Jawi and we read Malay, then we have sort of an expectation of how the letters can be arranged, right? And then once we see a word written in a certain way, or like a Malay word written in a certain way, then we sort of like have that as a sort of template, or as an index, basically, or that it'll be this word. And I think for English words, once there's like this very unusual just string of letters, that's, and the use of a lot of like what do you call it, like the letter, the fa, but it's like sort of, well, sorry, scratch that. But I mean, I think it's just mostly on the, like this like weird strings of letter that we don't recognize in Malay or in the language that we read. I think that's the easiest to do. It's the same with Arabic. I think once we used to reading Arabic words, then there are words that they're just like, this is not supposed to be Arabic. So this must be something else. This must be someone's names. This must be like what do you call it? Like a borrowed, like a loaned words from English, and that kind of thing. So yeah, I don't think there's a faster way to sort of identify that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think generally what I tend to also come across, I mean, you mentioned about Malay publications in the 50s and 60s, is that when English is inserted into the language, and usually this refers to names or even initials, they actually tend to elongate the words in order to kind of spell out the sound. Tendency is, especially for initials, where initials should be a single letter in English, it kind of, becomes a full 3 letters in Arabic script or in Jawi in order to kind of mimic or emulate that sound. So, I mean, English is used where it's necessary within Jawi, but, it can sometimes become sort of a reading stumbling block if you're not used to encountering it. But I think going back to how Aramayani was using English in that, I mean, did she actually communicate this to her collaborators, and what that do you know whether her collaborators have any insights, or did it impress upon them that it was English?
Yeah, that is a good question. So the thing about this performance is that, or the thing with her performances is that since I was not there mostly for her performances, so all of these, all of the materials that I work with are mostly documentations, either in video form or in photography or in photographs. So I think that's something that I might need to ask Rahmayani in person, and which I will, and after this. I need to ask Rahmayani for that. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Anissa. Well, the time now is 8 p.m. I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us in this particular session. There'll be another session next month on the Thursday. But just to wrap up, I think there is still a continued presence and significance to using Arabic script in even trying to kind of reclaim Jawi script. So we have a very long tradition, at least we can date it to 14th century or earlier, to kind of use as visual sources. But I think today, in terms of using Jawi script, it kind of has sort of a double-edged thing in a way, because on the one hand, it might seem overtly religious or conservative, but at the same time, it's also trying to detach or de-link from that idea and, reclaim it as something more accessible as a cultural heritage. And so with that, I will end today's talk. Thank you, Anissa, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you, Nora.
And for our audience, we would love to hear feedback from you. So if you can just scan the QR code that you see on the screen right now and leave us your feedback, we would be very grateful. So we look forward to seeing you again in the next session. Thank you and good night.
Thank you so much, Nora. Thank you, everyone.